Welcome to the What to Read Next podcast. In this podcast, your host, Lori Amin, will interview published authors to chat about their work, journey to getting published, and their book recommendations. If you share a passion for books and always looking for your next read, then join us. Hi, Marni. Welcome to What to Read Next podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
I'm so excited to chat with you. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I am a 30-something-year-old who is originally from Maine. I happen to be from the same town as Stephen King, actually. And it's where I went to college. And then I moved to Boston, where most of my books are based. Lived there for a couple of years with my boyfriend, who's now my husband. And then 16 years ago, we moved to the gorgeous state of Florida. So we live here with our yellow lab. And I am about to publish my 27th novel.
Oh my gosh. So when did you start writing?
My whole life. You know, if you ask my mom, she'll tell you that the way I got out of arguments was I would write my way out of them. If I wanted to tell them my viewpoint, I would write it down and slip it under my parents' door when they wouldn't talk to me because I did something bad. It's just always how I've communicated my whole life. So I just I think I was just meant to be in this career, honestly.
I love this. And were you always a romance reader or something you just stumble upon? You're like, I'm just going to write romance,
Well, I used to steal my mom's Danielle Steele and Nora Roberts books, from her. So that's all I ever read growing up as a kid. I mean, aside from all the books that we had to read from school and the Babysitter's Club and all that kind of stuff. Are We There, God, It's Me, Margaret? I will never forget that one.
Yes.
Romance has just always been in my blood, I think. My first two books are not romance, though. So I didn't start writing romance. Although I wrote chick lit at first, and it didn't work out because I'm just not a chick lit writer. And then my first two books that got published were literary fiction.
Oh, and so what made you decide you go for literary fiction? What was your writing process for literary fiction? And then we can chat about writing process for romance.
So it's kind of a morbid story. I lost a really good friend of mine to an overdose. And so
I'm so sorry.
So it inspired a story. And I knew addiction from the enabler standpoint, but I didn't know it from the addict standpoint. So I have a little bit of a journalistic background. So I just hit the streets and I started interviewing addicts. And I knew that there was a story in there. When I started writing after she passed away, it was just therapeutic for me. And as I was writing sort of my thoughts and processing her death, it turned into a story. And then for me to get the background and the knowledge of the addiction, that's when I hit the streets, and it turned into a duet. And the first book is called Memoirs Aren't Fairy Tales. And it's a girl who's addicted to heroin. And so it's very morbid, but that's how I started. And so from there, I sold the rights to that book to a small publisher based in Seattle, and there is sex in those two novels. And they said to me at the time, you have a knack for writing sex. Have you ever considered writing erotica? And I said, well, I wanted to always write chick lit because I thought that I was Carrie Bradshaw and that's what I was meant to do. And he said, the publisher said, why don't you just try writing erotica? And that was it. I never went back. So.
Oh my gosh. And so what is the process like to write romance? Because your books are different. You're not just your typical, cookie cutter romance novels that would just heat the beats and you just get there, they happily ever after,
I have Zen diagrams on my walls of all timelines, and my books are complicated. So they really start with an idea. When We Met is the book that's releasing in 2 weeks. And it started with a concept in my head of, if you had a decision to choose how your life would take you, what path would you choose? And so the idea starts forming. And that probably happened about a year ago. And I write the idea down and I just kind of let it simmer in my brain, because I don't know that idea can actually transfer to paper. It's sort of two different concepts. Just because in my head it looks great doesn't mean that it's going to be able to be read or written. It took me a while to figure out the format of this book because, it's just a complicated concept. So usually it's about a year. I process. I talk to my publicist, who's also my best friend, and we kind of come up with some ideas of how I can translate the idea to paper. And then I just start writing. And honestly, I do outlines and I do have diagrams and I have book Bibles for every single book because my timelines are crazy and all over the place. But I just kind of start writing and let my imagination take me there. And I wander off a lot on the outlines that I create. And then suddenly we have a book. And then I just edit the heck out of it So that's really my process.
I love this. And what has been the process writing in the midst of the pandemic? Although things are different in Florida, but we're still in it's a weird place. It's a weird time. So
It's been crazy and not easy. My husband and I are wanderlusts, and all we do is travel. And so I get most of my inspiration from traveling and visiting new places, and not being able to do that and sort of being cooped up at home has been a challenge to write. So I did write a book during quarantine, and I'm just not ready to publish it yet. It's just sort of living on my computer. But since then, I finished When We Met, and I'm almost done with another book also. And so it's been challenging, kind of tapping into this creative memory and remembering what life was like prior to masks and not being with friends. And it's hard. It really is.
it really is hard. I think it's just like life as we know it. It's like so different. And it's interesting. Like I just read a book that had some COVID, and I was like, choose it. Like I was like, it's not even mentioned COVID, but it's mentioned it sort of. And you're like, oh, I'm not ready for this,
I agree. I couldn't read it either. We're living it. We're such in the thick of it still. I don't want to read about it.
Yeah. So it's just like, I feel like it's hard. It's hard to, like, how do you create a world? And like, because we read for escape most of the time, just to do something, just get out of this world. So I can imagine you writing. I don't think you want to be writing about what's going on in the world. So,
It's hard.
but your book deals with something that happened in historical moment. So the Boston bombing. So that's like the trigger event. What was kind of like your trigger? Was that part of the story, or were you just realizing like, this could be a good place to do this, kind of like whatever decision you make makes an impact?
The book is actually the second book in a series, but I have to say that both books are total standalones. They're not a continuation. I did steal a character the world starts with When Ashes Fall. And so there is a similar theme in When Ashes Fall is When We Met. And so Smith, who is the best friend in When We Met, is the hero in When Ashes Fall. So the world started there, and it's probably my most favorite book that I've written. And I wrote that book 2 years ago, but was inspired to write the book 3 years ago. And so I've had this idea in the back of my head for When We Met. Like I said, it usually takes me about a year. So I've had it for about a year, and I knew that it would fit perfectly in the When Ashes Fall sort of worlds. And so I fit it in. It's almost hard to describe why and how, because I don't want to give away any spoilers to either of the books.
Yeah, I think it's good to just go blind. Other than it's just like it's set in Boston, and things happen, and
That's how I describe it. It's set in Boston. There's a hero and heroine, and things happen. Like, honestly, that's pretty much all I can say. It's
yeah, and just go blind. So, changing topics. So, what is your favorite like trope or idea that you'd like to write?
I love love triangles. I know they're so controversial, but they're so fun to write because they're so messy and complicated. And I love messy and complicated. But I also really love second chance romances because I feel like relationships are just so challenging. And I love the idea of people meeting younger and then getting back together later in life, or being together and breaking up and then having a second chance. Like, I think that when you find your soulmate, it doesn't necessarily mean things don't work out now. It doesn't mean that they're not going to work out forever. And I love that concept. So let's see, those two are my favorite, but I love to read dark romance, and I love to write that too. So
I love this. And so, speaking of dark romance, do you have any recommendations or any authors that we should check out?
Kay Webster is the queen of dark romance. Jonna Darling, she also is very, very, very good at her dark stuff. Willow Winters has some dark romance that I've also really enjoyed. 3 of them are fabulous.
I love this. And so, what are you working next?
So there's going to be a third book. After When We Met is another book. Again, total standalone. You don't have to read the previous 2. It's more of a prequel to When Ashes Fall. So if you've read When Ashes Fall, then the character Dylan will make sense to you. And he is a reoccurring character in this new book, which I haven't released the title. So we're just going to call it new book for right now.
Yeah.
This one's a little bit darker than the previous two. It is in the same world, so it deals with the same kind of world stuff that's going on at that time. It does take place in 2013, which if you've read these two books, that date will mean something to you.
Mm-hmm.
So, but like I said, it's more of a prequel. So it takes place prior to When Ashes Fall. And it's just another messy love story.
I love this. What has been a book you read this past year or last year or at some point that you can't stop gushing about?
The Idea of You is one of my favorite romance novels ever.
Yes.
If you haven't read it, you need to right now. I've read it like 7 times. I just love it. And I don't have time to read a lot just because I'm always writing. But that book is one of my favorites. And Daisy Jones and the Six. I recommend that book endlessly too.
I love this. Well, I would say The Idea of You. I'm living for Harry Styles and Olivia Wilde living.
Oh, fabulous.
It's like, oh my gosh, she just needs to have a 14-year-old to me.
Yes, I agree.
It's like, okay, it's happening. Like, we foreshadow the future. Yes, I am living for it. I've been recommending The Idea of You pretty much everywhere. It's on Kindle Unlimited right now, so there's no excuse for those who don't want to pay full price. I did pay full price, and it's still like so good.
Her writing is just phenomenal. And yet the storyline and every time I read it, like I think it's going to change. Like I feel like, oh, I'm going to change the story. Or when I get to the last page, it's going to have a different ending. I love the ending. I don't mean that. And it's just beautiful every single time I read it.
It is so good. Yeah, I have to say, I pretty love it. Where can we buy your books, and tell us where we can find you online?
So you can buy my books everywhere. I'm a wide author. So Amazon, Kobo, obviously Kindle, Apple, all over the place. And online, I'm Marni Mann at Instagram, Marni Mann on Facebook. Just Marni Mann's my real name, so you can find me pretty much everywhere.
Awesome. Thank you, Marni, for being on the show.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. This was awesome.
If you enjoyed this podcast, feel free to share with friends, subscribe, rate, and review the show. This is the easiest way to support this podcast. Once you connect with fellow romance readers and make new friends, get weekly book recommendations, attend monthly meetups, then join our Patreon community. You can join at whattoreadnextblog.com/Patreon. Romance lovers, check out Queen Bee Reads Etsy shop for cute and comfortable bookish apparel. The shop also features social justice apparel and fun items from some of your favorite TV shows like The Schitt's Creek and The Office. Use code WhatToRead10 to save. Visit whattoreadnextblog.com/QueenBeeReads. What to Read Next podcast is part of the Frolic Podcast Network. Discover new podcasts to love on frolic.media/podcast. Thank you so much for listening and have a great day.